Hello, and welcome to the CannAtlantic Conference, the country's first mid-Atlantic cannabis conference brought to you by the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists. If you're watching this specific presentation, this presentation is the State of State Cannabis Report for New Jersey. Presenting this State of State report is Dr. Monica Taing, board member of the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation organization, and Faye Coleman, who is CEO of Pure Genesis. They will both walk us through what is going on in New Jersey as New Jersey gets closer to legalizing, or at least voting to legalize, in November, and what's at stake right now for New Jersey's current medical marijuana market, and what could happen after legalization, should legalization happen in the Garden State. So we'll start off with Dr. Monica Taing, and then we'll go to Faye Coleman as well. Monica, thank you so much for joining and giving this amazing and incredibly important panel, or this slide. Actually, I'm going to restart this intro. Sorry. We'll we will go to Faye Coleman, and hopefully you will get a lot of information on what the current state of New Jersey's medical marijuana market is and what's in store should the state legalize. Dr. Monica Taing, thank you so much for doing this presentation and providing so much information for our viewers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tahid. Thank you, PDJ. Thank you to the CannAtlantic team for having me. It is truly an honor to present to you today and to discuss from a medical perspective, as a licensed medical professional, what growing pains we've experienced in the New Jersey Medicinal Marijuana Program, NJMMP, since its inception and layout. So much has happened in the last few years that are really exciting and important, and will tie into considerations for if the state does vote in favor of the ballot referendum in November. I'm giving you the medical perspective point of view because I want to give you some background about myself and what I've been doing professionally in the medical cannabis space and what it means for and how it transcends into the adult use market. So I'm a doctor of pharmacy, or PharmD. I graduated from Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts. I got involved in medical cannabis through serendipity and genuine academic curiosity because I devoted a research co-op to the endocannabinoid system. So I learned about how this works in our body, and I was shocked to learn that a lot of medical professionals don't get didactic coverage and formal education and training on the endocannabinoid system, which is this evolutionary receptor system in our body, and it is able naturally to process cannabis and cannabinoids in a way that, like how a lock and key effect works. So if different types of cannabinoids are keys, then the cannabinoid receptors of our bodies, our receptors, are the locks. And the lock and key effect is how we can turn on so many bodily functions, physiological responses to cannabis in the body and brain. I'm giving you the science because this is something I've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years. I've been training medical professionals all around New Jersey. I've gone through academic medical institutions, clinical practice sites, hospitals, you name it, colleges, universities. I've traveled all around the state. I've worked with so many different entities to provide this evidence-based education on the endocannabinoid system so that medical providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, other pharmacists get this knowledge that I gained in pharmacy school, and they understand the rules and regulations of the NJMMP. They understand how to certify a patient, how to monitor for therapeutic and toxic monitoring parameters when a patient is on cannabis, the risk of drug-drug interactions and dosing, and I could go on and on. But I'm drawing from this experience and telling you today from what I've been doing in the space in New Jersey, from what's been going on with the movement to raise awareness around the ballot referendum. The healthcare provider community is an untapped resource and an untapped group that hasn't been really approached and made aware of what's going on. If they do have any inkling of an idea that the medical program exists, they don't know enough. They don't know enough about the science. They don't know enough about the research available to back harm reduction strategies for patient safety. And fundamentally, the medical program, while it's going through all these stages of growth, is going to also be a simultaneous yet separate track that coexists with adult use if that market is legalized in New Jersey. I'm drawing from experience from other states like Massachusetts, Illinois, and Michigan, and I've worked in those states with the medical community, with the colleges and universities, getting workforce training rolling out and research studies designed. And there's a lot of lessons learned that we can take from those other states and apply them to New Jersey. But first and foremost, it's getting everyone aware of what's on the ballot, and it's getting everyone prepared to make the best informed decision about how they will vote and why they should vote for legalization. So let's begin. So New Jersey, the Garden State, also sometimes called the medicine chest of the country, has a lot going on in terms of the advocacy, the outreach, the opposition, truthfully, to legalization, those who oppose and want to keep it federally illegal or not have it passed by the state for having the legal adult use market here. And there needs to be the engagement with those who are on the fence, those who oppose it, and then making sure that advocates and activists break out of the boundaries that we have inherently in something so controversial. While we can get caught up kind of being like siloed in these groups where like different advocacy organizations like Minorities for Medical Marijuana, of which I'm the National Director of Research and Clinical Education, with Marijuana Policy Project, with ACLU, with so many groups that are fundamentally focused and really zoned in on the legalization movement nationally and on the state level, we have to break out of these silos to talk to groups, other groups, and all audiences about, of course, raising awareness, and then the reason for why decriminalization isn't really enough and legalization is really the measure that we should be approaching. It's interesting because like in a socio-political lens right now, decrim is arguably considered too much and gives too many like allowances, but that's only like legalizing a certain part of the supply chain or certain degrees of cannabis, whether it's like manufacturing, processing, distribution, sales, or like consumption in-house in a specific like private residence. There's all these like finer nuances to decrim, and decrim isn't enough in terms of all the opportunities that legalization would offer. So a lot's been going on. Again, bear in mind you're going to get the background and context of what's going on with medical and how medical marijuana in New Jersey, like the other medical states that are operating, have been rocked by COVID-19. It's a fascinating time because this year is super tumultuous and there's been so much upheaval, but cannabis ultimately being deemed as an essential business is something that operators, whether they're multi-state operators or like new licensed state like entities, they have to deal with the fact that this is federally still a Schedule I drug, and they don't get like small business loan relief. They don't get a lot of the allowances that are allowing some business entities to pivot in light of the pandemic, in light of the recession. Cannabis has a bootstrap, self-funded, self-sustaining kind of economy unto itself because of those federal restrictions and all the red tape that really hurt the markets that are operational. And that goes with medical in so many ways. So we'll talk about that. But also, it's something to consider because there's so many lessons to be learned from the medical program that I think would apply and also be facilitated and catalytic should adult use legalization pass. But I just want to share with you that there's some like things going on in New Jersey, and I'm going to be broad sweeping just to give you some background and context. Telemedicine is being considered for certifying practitioners licensed in the state who want to certify patients for the medical cannabis program. Was voted on yesterday, and it's a great reference to use Marijuana Policy Project as a source of information because they're covering all the states and they give so many amazing details, and they're a great reference that I use regularly and cannot recommend, especially if you're new to the cannabis space. If you're new to this conference, welcome. Definitely check out the work that MPP is doing because they do phenomenal coverage of everything going on. So there's also some provisions and drafts around decriminalization, but I'm not going to like really focus on the specifics of it. Just bear in mind that decriminalization is also like an option that exists and is something that's being reviewed and considered at the state level. And legislatively, decrim is just an incomplete compromise, and we're going to talk about it. Also, there's other really good informational references or resources like NJ Cannabis Insider that I recommend for people, whether you're already involved in the space or, again, new. I can't recommend them enough because you'll get regular updates, and the coverage is comprehensive for the state. So I really look at the team at NJ Cannabis Insider for their great insights about how many different moving pieces there are in medical cannabis, in the state-specific level of considering how to forward decrim, if that's a path, or even pursuing legalization and then raising awareness. Okay, so a brief snapshot or history of the NJMMP starts 10 years ago when then Governor Corzine signed the medical marijuana bill into law. It was like a flurry of paperwork, and then, since then, the rollout has been intermittent. And the first round of licensed alternative treatment centers, these ATCs, are dispensaries. The dispensaries for the first round that applied before any dispensaries existed in New Jersey, they were mandated to be nonprofit. And there were 6 that won the licenses. So I call them like the first round RFA dispensaries or ATCs. And the licensure lays out with 2 ATCs in the northern region of New Jersey, 2 in the central region, and 2 licensed ATCs in South New Jersey. There's been, since, another second round of RFAs, and those licenses have been awarded, and those dispensaries are still navigating how to get up and running with their facility and scaling to size, getting operational and ready in light of the pandemic going on, and it's happening in a very piecemeal fashion. And there's also like a third round RFA, but I won't get too ahead of myself. In 2018, after the program had its slow rollout gradually from the original 6 ATCs they were opening and serving patients that were certified in the program, when Governor Phil Murphy came into office, he was very staunch, very passionate, and in favor of expanding access in the cannabis program. And that was achieved with Executive Order 6. When that report was published by Dr. Sharif Amal, he was reviewing the populace of New Jersey, how many patients potentially qualified based on qualifying condition, how many how the dispensaries were 5 to 6 that were operational at the time, how they were accommodating meeting the supply and demand of the medical program, and how they were also just not enough like dispensaries. The report was great in that it also mandated removing a lot of barriers to access for cost of certifying, for the qualifying conditions approved, the list was expanded, for so many other provisions that have been hindrances for the program originally, they were addressed. Some, but not all. So Executive Order 6 was a really great moment for the program, for patients, for caregivers, for physicians. It removed a lot of stringent rules that were prohibitive or kind of complicated to navigate. And then in 2019, Governor Phil Murphy signed the Passionate Youth Medical Cannabis Act, and that also provided a navigable framework for the state to continue expanding the medical program, being catalytic and facilitating access for more patients. More qualifying conditions were added, but then also a regulatory framework, and we're going to go over that, like the CRC, and ways that should the adult use market be legalized in New Jersey. There's a way to transfer the regulatory oversight and authority from the New Jersey Department of Health, which currently oversees the NJMMP, so that the CRC will be able to navigate how we can scale the size, licensing more operators, more parts of a horizontal supply chain or horizontally integrated market where different manufacturers, producers, distributors can all work to get different types of licenses and really scale the size to really truly meet the demand of a state with about 9 million people. So if we don't have enough cannabis currently for the medicinal program, I'm going to continue to keep licensing alternative treatment centers. There's also a framework that we're going to need to work off of so that we can scale the size. Also, if you have adult use legalization, yes, grandfather in those that are already actively cultivating, packaging, processing, and testing cannabis, but then also just to make sure that we don't have enough medical cannabis product for the medical patients, of course, and then also the adult use consumer market. So in 2020, we're still waiting on the third round RFA, and it's because of the court-ordered stay, and that has really been I guess, a neutral, or like, I want to say stopgap, but it's just been stuck in neutral. There's like days of waiting is really holding up the medical program from expanding. So that's one thing to keep in mind and like something to like be aware of and like watching this all unfold. But it's a lot to deal with. It's a pretty stressful situation because ultimately, if this is about whole plant medicine and access for patients, the fact that we have the ability to produce enough cannabis products and like keep that supply demand curve is harmful for patients, and I hope that it resolves eventually. I'm cautiously optimistic. But going into what the NJMMP currently is like in terms of like what happened since the executive order 6, and this is a list of the qualifying conditions that are approved. And again, especially in 2018, especially 2019, the Governor Murphy more qualifying conditions have been approved, notably anxiety, chronic pain, different types of chronic pain, and that's been huge. PTSD was added in 2016. Opioid use disorder being added is really heartening because that is also a qualifying condition in certain other states, like New York State. The current state of the program, like if I were to give you a to-date snapshot, there's about 87,000 patients that are registered and certified and seen by a medical professional. Most commonly, most likely, a medical doctor or a doctor of osteopathy. There's approximately 1,200 certifying physicians, and DOs, and over 3,000 caregivers. With the New Jersey medical marijuana program's pivot in light of the pandemic, curbside pickup is becoming the new normal, essentially. So not only are there like the supply demand issues that I alluded to earlier, but then also the NJMMP is working within this new framework, this paradigm where the curbside pickup is something, but also like delivery is now being like considered heavily. The fact that like telemedicine is going to be reviewed and like approved or like voted on for approval, so that physicians can see patients without like immune compromised, chronically debilitated, possibly geriatric patients having to travel around the state. Like that is huge. And there's more progress to be made. While there have been a lot of improvements, I think there's just so much more that we can do, and I think that we'll get there. With events like this, with this education, with this ongoing engagement with like advocates and activists continuously working with regulators and policymakers, we're seeing improvement, and there's still so much more where we can go. So I mentioned 820, National Youth Medical Cannabis Act, and when I had said the CRC, it's the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, and they're going to be the board that oversees this medical program, adult use if it's legalized, 5 appointed members of the CRC who also participate in really standardizing both simultaneous tracks and really implementing an infrastructure that is regulatory inherently, but also standardizes and legitimizes medical cannabis so that we can address all those barriers that I alluded to earlier for patients and for the emerging markets, the nascent businesses that will be working in areas like consumption lounges, delivery, third-party testing, packaging, labeling, so many other aspects of cannabis beyond the plant-touching, dispensary, vertically integrated or horizontally integrated model are going to exist with adult use legalization. So it's always important to bear in mind that, like, yes, you could be plant touching. Should you want to participate in the market, you could also be non-plant touching. And there's so many ancillary opportunities to participate still in the legal market. So going back to A20, it's great to know that with A20, physicians assistants and advanced practice nurses, nurse practitioners can also authorize or certify patients. Bear in mind, you cannot prescribe a federally Schedule 1 controlled substance. You can certify. So that's, I'm very specific with the language, but that's just meticulous attention to detail that's important. Because it also reminds us that state level is so focused, but also like there's still the movement for like federal consideration of like rescheduling or descheduling, preferably descheduling over rescheduling. That's another conversation for another day. So there's the caregiver that's permitted currently for the medical cannabis patients. The caregiver, for those who aren't aware, can they certify with the program with the JMMP, and they can purchase, pick up, and essentially like provide all the, they can represent the certified registered patient, whether at the dispensary, patient office visits, and they can make sure that adherence and continuity of care is achieved for the patient if the patient is debilitated, if the patient can't be homebound, for many reasons. If the patient is pediatric, caregiver is an important role, but the A20 Act also expands the types of caregivers that are available. So you can actually have more now. So instead of like a 1-to-1 ratio of like patient to caregiver, now that's been doubled. And the institutional caregiver is someone that's going to be really important for the future of medical cannabis and should have adult use legalization. That will also be huge because the institutional caregiver is going to play a vital role with standards of care in inpatient or hospital settings. For medical, that's huge for patient safety, for pharmacovigilance, for monitoring the ongoing potential therapeutic effects of cannabis and cannabinoid medicine. But I also see the institutional caregiver is playing like a huge role with training, with professionalism in the medical cannabis sector for the licensed healthcare side. The institutional caregiver looking at A20, looking at the specifications and requirements of an institutional caregiver. An institutional caregiver could be a registered nurse. I think nurses are incredible and they provide all this bedside manner and patient monitoring. Drug adherence is important. Nurses are incredible and they can definitely be trained and educated and empowered to be these institutional caregivers. There's a workforce training that can be done for all of the nurses available in New Jersey, or even like beyond nurses. There's just so many licensed healthcare professionals, doctors, pharmacists. Like I could go on. There's just so many in the healthcare provider network that like everyone does need this training. Everyone needs like this background and understanding of the medical cannabis program. But then also, when I was talking, I just did like a virtual medical grand round, and I was going over the rules and regulations of the program. I was going over A20. I asked the providers if they knew about the November ballot referendum, and overwhelmingly they weren't even. It was the first time they were hearing about it from me, and I was like, "Wow, that's definitely an area of an underserved audience and needs to be engaged with continuously because raising awareness is the first step. Educating them with this background and context and history of the medical program is important to really help them overcome their inherent stigmas that are prevalent, the common myths and misconceptions, and then the rationalization for why we also need adult use legalized, and how that can coexist and will coexist with medical. I think it's important to consider. Okay, so I'm going to transition. Why should New Jersey legalize adult use cannabis if the medical program already exists? An actual question I get in every medical grand round I do virtually, in every in-service training series, the modules I do for providers, and I train different types of healthcare professionals. I train substance use disorder clinics. I train nurses that are in the spectrum of addiction, of harm reduction, of HIV/AIDS. Really, anyone I train and hospitalists who are treating patients who are certified for the medical program. They really consider different types of specialized medical professionals. That this is their number one question and concern, and I understand where they're coming from. The second most common question I get from the medical community is also, why should we legalize when we can just decriminalize? And I think it's the lack of, first of all, the understanding and education around the endocannabinoid system. A fundamental component that if there's an endogenous opioid receptor system in our body, the endorphin system of receptors that is primed and ready to act to endorphins or endogenous opioids that our body produces for like pain management, for like exercise, and for really like homeostasis and biological balance in the body, then there's no reason that medical providers shouldn't be educated on the endocannabinoid system, because it's a specialized receptor system that also explains the physiology and pharmacology of how receptors work in the body, how cannabinoids act at them in special ways, and all those effects. That's huge in terms of really providing a framework for like rationalizing science-driven drug policy reform. Data and real science, medical research should be driving the policies that we write. It shouldn't be based off of pseudoscience. It shouldn't be based off of propaganda. It shouldn't be formed or written in terms of the laws that we have to abide by at the federal, state, and local level off of like incomplete science studies and like outdated biases that are in terms of drug prohibition and the war on drugs racially tied to like marginalization of minority communities. It's not fundamentally based on like actual scientific findings for pharmacology. There's no harm reduction framework to work with in terms of if drug use from a public health perspective is like a medical concern. The medical community should be engaged. The medical community should be empowered with this information. They should understand that yes, medical is a program that we need to protect and prioritize, and let's really iron out like all of the issues that are part of the medical program as well. Like adult use and medical, like I had said earlier, one cannot truly fully exist without the other. Why is that? Well, if it's a Schedule I drug, patients have to pay out of pocket, and you can't get it covered nationally by insurance programs, federal assistance. There are so many issues with it being criminalized. Like this botanical potential drug therapy option is now arguably weaponized to fuel the prison industrial complex. But when I'm talking to medical professionals, I like explain to them that if you're talking about it being a drug therapy, then we should have more robust research with larger sample sizes of thousands of patients and all the clinical trials that evaluate therapeutic potential and the adverse effects that can come from like too much of a dose, like a disproportionate, incorrect amount that's not personalized to the patient. And if we're talking about how, in my medical background, if we're talking about like the different cannabinoid therapies, and we talk about like Epidiolex being a plant-derived pharmaceutical, that is not scheduled. It was originally not scheduled, and then it was put in Schedule 5, which is like one of the most least restrictive categories for the Controlled Substances Act. It was then removed, which is not common. That's honestly like a monumental moment for the medical program, for like medical cannabis everywhere internationally. It's a landmark moment because we've gotten the plant-derived pharmaceutical formulation, and it's not scheduled, and it has therapeutic benefit. Why would cannabis as plant medicine? Why would herbal cannabis still be Schedule 1? It doesn't meet up with the Schedule 1 requirements, making a high substance of high abuse, substance of no therapeutic potential, and not enough research. And it's why we're having this conversation, why it's so incredible that the CannAtlantic team are having this conference today, because it's so important. The medical providers get this history of the drug policy prohibition that's been really fueling the war on drugs, and why we are where we are now. Why is it so restrictive in the medical program? Because fundamentally it's Schedule 1 federally. They don't get this education, they don't get this background. So I think once they hear it and they process it, it's a lot of teaching at one time. But rationally, we have to prepare for the future. Rationally, we have to understand other states are starting to do it, other countries are starting to do it. There's so much potential for remedying harms from the one, but then also for research, for clinical, pharmaceutical, R&D, research and development, for the future of allowing so many different markets and entities to participate in the programs, for adult use program and medical program at different parts of plant touching our ancestors. So I'm saying this over and over, but this is to summarize why we need to educate each other in all audiences, all age groups, everyone, voting particularly, everyone can vote. We want to talk about why decriminalization is not enough, and then legalization is definitely the so prioritizing restorative justice. The war on drugs has been raging on for about 80 years and been incredibly harmful, and the data is irrefutable in its disproportionate impact on minority communities. The fact that you can have pharmaceutical companies start producing plant-derived cannabinoid medications while people are still serving life sentences for nonviolent crimes or possession is just unconscionable to me, and that is a point that I need to emphasize with medical professionals when I'm working with them. They're like, okay, we can just settle on decrim. I think decrim is good enough, and I'm not going to vote in favor of legalization. And I'm like, well, I think we should also consider this historical point in terms of where this country has gone, what has happened, and how to right those wrongs. Protecting public health and safety. Fundamentally, legalization is a public health intervention. This is a safety measure for public welfare, for the safety of children who get sometimes targeted by the underground, unregulated market, and they are vulnerable. Not only are pediatric, but young children, adolescents, all these kids that are being targeted by that illicit market. They're vulnerable because God knows what that product is. It's Q2, it's spice. Professionals still conflate with THC or CBD. Plant-derived cannabinoids are different from synthetic cannabinoids in terms of their effect on the body. And there are lethal synthetic cannabinoids like Q2 and spice that could really hurt someone. Not only an adolescent youth, but also a vulnerable patient who can't afford the medical cannabis program. So they're going to turn to a cheaper source, and they could get contaminated product, adulterated product. They could really, and if this patient is autoimmune compromised, if they're suffering from cancer, if they're suffering from chronic debilitating condition like PTSD, how can they possibly derive any therapeutic benefit from a product that hasn't been vetted as from a third party testing perspective as safe, as unadulterated, as the actual potency of the cannabinoid needed to get symptomatic relief? It's just there's so many risks and harms with this continuous, I guess, incomplete, really irregular form of medical kind of existing legal, being a gray market in certain ways, and then not having legalization outright. It's public health measure for legalization. Also, thinking about how nascent this all is, with the emerging markets that want to participate in legal cannabis. Decrim isn't going, again, it's only going to be legalizing certain degrees of supply chain of markets that can exist, and then not having it like fully legal is just going to be counterproductive because everyone's some older perspectives that I've been hearing are like, oh well, if it's federally legal or even at the state level, like anything is an issue, so we'll just keep it legal. And I'm like, okay, you can still figure out how to do this. Like, this is why we would work together. Like, this is why the states that are doing it right are bringing in activists and advocates, of course, for the drug policy reform component, but they're also speaking to scientists, researchers, medical professionals to get this side of this missing piece. Like, this is going to be comprehensive in the way that we have to all work together if we actually want to ensure that this is going to be successful for legalizing, for having these emerging markets of plant touching or non-plant touching ancillary businesses to be able to effectively use their transferable skill set and the regulations and laws that govern their markets and businesses and their subject matter expertise, I guess. Like, there's just so many parts of it that we would need to bring under one umbrella and unify, and that is best facilitated with legalization. Decrim would just be an incomplete stopgap, and it's another hindrance that wouldn't help remove all the barriers that we need to overcome to really make this a viable, robust, and ultimately productive and lucrative market. And also tying into ending the war on drugs and addressing all the harms inflicted on minority communities from prohibition, from cannabis still being Schedule I. Social equity and minority-owned businesses participating in the legal medical market and then also the legal adult use market would be huge. Because think about all the innovation, think of all the competition would be incredibly compelling in that from what we've seen from the simultaneous adult use and medical markets that exist in the states that I had mentioned earlier, there's different facets that are pretty niche to cannabis consumption, like craft cannabis uses, and also like personalized precision medicine, where there's different formulations that are available for like symptom-specific, patient-specific dosing strategies to target whatever symptom they're dealing with, whether it's anxiety, whether it's insomnia, whether it's an autoimmune or neurodegenerative disorder, like if it's IBD, IBS, Crohn's, like a digestive disorder like that, would be addressed differently with a different product formulation than something like HIV/AIDS and the neuropathic pain or nausea and vomiting or rapid weight loss, like all these things. But we need to have the legal market be able to substantiate and to reinforce all that innovation in all those different markets. So thinking about it in a way that like adult use and medical are separate and simultaneous tracks. They coexist, they overlap. You arguably can't have one without the other. And this ballot referendum coming up in November is huge for considering we can really turn the tides on really impacting change, everlasting change, productive change. Like a lot of politicians think that cannabis legalization is like flipping a switch and that they can generate so much revenue from like taxes alone. It's just so much more than a revenue generator. And that's what I hope to outline today in this presentation, and going over like what the context and history of medical like expansion in the program has been like in New Jersey, and why legalization is fundamental for, of course, the Garden State, but also nationally. And it's going to be an important time of reckoning for what's going on right now in the country. And I think that this is going to be something that can help rectify everything in terms of mass job losses that the country is undergoing, in terms of, again, research and clinical innovation, like therapeutic potential is boundless. And also, I know I keep bringing it up, but it's just so important. Like the war on drugs is still going on, we have to stop it. And with that, I'm going to leave you with like the current legalization efforts in New Jersey and like, what's going on. I'm not going to speak to what's on the ballot. I'm not going to like dissect and analyze it in every detail because that's not my subject matter expertise. I'm a licensed pharmacist, and medical program means a lot to me, but legalization also means a lot to me for all the reasons I just outlined. But there are advocates out there that you should definitely engage with, and these are the best and the brightest our state has to offer in terms of their advocacy and their information. NJ Can 2020 is a coalition, and the coalition affiliates are listed here. I am a board member of Doctors of Cannabis Regulation, and New Jersey ACLU has been great, the Latino Action Network has been great, and the LCP has been so great, and like all these groups are amazing, like NJ Cannabis Association. Everyone has just been so impactful and been banding together and joining forces and bringing different perspectives together. Like from law enforcement action partnership, we have the law enforcement side, and then from regulation, we have the medical profession side. And we're all in this together. We have to all work together to really talk about how we can approach this in a multimodal way. And that's what I hope to demonstrate today by talking about legalization in the movement. It's talking to everyone. It's talking to all voters, all residents of the state, people who could be on the fence to sway this in any way, people who are staunchly committed to just compromising with DPRIM. It's just not enough. But I do want to highlight that I'm also the Director of Research and Clinical Education for Minorities to Medical Marijuana, and we have some amazing advocates in New Jersey and the states who will go over this, the state of New Jersey and what's going on the ballot, and they'll dive into the specifics. We'll take a deep dive, and I just want to shout out my M4MM team, my M4MM family for being so great, because we're all in this together. It takes a village, clearly, and I hope you guys enjoyed my medical perspective on this in terms of contextualizing and understanding the history of medical, where medical has gone, where medical could go, and what that means for adult use, and why it is important to consider adult use. Like, learn as much as you can. Follow the resources and the references that I've mentioned to get like the state in-depth analysis of what's going on. Follow these groups. Everyone is so informative. Everyone is so knowledgeable about this, but there's so much more that I hope you'll learn from, not only today, but as we head into November. So with that, I'm going to be concluding our presentation. Again, thank you to me, thank you to the CannAtlantic team. I hope that you guys got some nuggets of information from my perspective about what's going on, and I hope you continue to also continue this advocacy with us, continue telling everyone to raise awareness and informing them with these like kernels of information why legalization is so important to our state. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for the very warm introduction. I really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Faye Coleman, and I have been asked to share the 2020 State of the State for New Jersey. There's some significant priorities that New Jersey has on tap today. I'm going to share a little on adult use and voting, our current application that is still in play, a little on the history of cannabis legislation in our state and the path forward, and I'm going to end with sharing insights around social equity, which is such a priority. And given some of the moments and movements of today, we will speak to that and what some states are doing to move social equity forward. So let's begin with adult use legalization and voting. Voting to legalize adult use is on the ballot for a November vote. So what do folks need to know, and what should they do? First, we all know that prohibition has failed. In states that have legalized cannabis, they've seen a significant increase in both jobs and tax revenue. They've also seen a reduction in opioid use, benzodiazepine, and alcohol use. Currently in New Jersey, we spend more than $147 million of taxpayer monies arresting and prosecuting more than 36,000 people every year for simple possession. It's time we flip the switch and generate more than $300 million and new tax revenues, create thousands of new jobs, and incentivize new entrepreneurs. As part of the New Jersey Cannabis Business Association, we are on the steering committee with NJCAN 2020. And as part of that committee, our citizens have been polled in every category we are concerned about regarding adult legalization. And the response has been fantastic, with a cross-section of voters being around, we would say around 60+% approval. This has been great because now we have a roadmap towards who we are going to be targeting in the campaign. And we will have a broad message for sure to make certain we have included everyone. The focus is to make certain we have informed voters, and more important, to ensure our citizens actually vote. Sometimes when we vote, we don't vote on every ballot question. Clearly, the presidential race has everyone's attention. We need to remind everyone to vote their hearts on the candidates and then go to the ballot questions and vote yes on ballot question 1. Let's remember, illegal markets don't create jobs. Illegal markets don't pay taxes. Illegal markets don't test their products to ensure there are no pesticides, heavy metals, and other toxins. Illegal markets don't care if the customer is 12, 15, or 50. Dispensary operators do. You cannot enter a dispensary unless you've already proven that you're over 21, because it's the law, of course. So legalization is directly aligned with safety. I want you guys to hear that. Legalization is directly aligned with safety. So for the first time in history, you know exactly what is and what's not in your cannabis. Now, let's switch gears and talk about another priority for the state and the most recent New Jersey application process. Now, the question is, where is it now? The applications are currently held up primarily by 3 different types of lawsuits. 1, we have some technical glitch issues that need to be resolved. 2, we have a lack of support letters from municipalities. And 3, we have some that have filed past the deadline. So more so a day late. This again is not all, but most. The court, however, is expected to make a ruling in October. In terms of lawsuits for discrimination, we're not aware of any at this time. Now, we have looked forward to talk about voting on adult use, which is coming in November, and we have looked back where we are on the application process. Now let's go back a little further and talk a little about the history of the New Jersey program for medical cannabis. Where is it now? And what's the path to legislation for adult use? Let's begin with New Jersey's initial medical marijuana law, the Compassionate Use of Medical Marijuana Act, which was, interestingly enough, signed into law on Governor Corzine's last day in office. Governor Christie was left to implement the law, which he did, however, very begrudgingly and slowly, and with significant amount of restrictions. When Governor Murphy was elected, he expanded the industry and eliminated many of the arbitrary restrictions. On July 2nd, 2019, Governor Murphy signed into law Jake Honig's Law, which further expands allowable conditions. It reduced costs for patients and established other programs such as home delivery. Jake's Law also created the Cannabis Regulatory Commission, which will, going forward, regulate both the medical and adult use industries within our state. The challenge right now is with delivery, which impacts our elderly and disabled. We need implementing language or the regulation to state how this will be operated. So with that, let's talk about the path to legislation. In terms of what's next, after the vote has passed for adult use legalization, enabling language for legislation is what happens next. We expect it will happen between Election Day and the end of the calendar year. What that will look like, we're not sure. But the baseline for the enabling language we expect to be Senator Scutari's bill S 2703 from last session, which ended this past January. This was the bill that had the majority of the debate and attention. So once the new bill was introduced, it should look a lot like Bill S2703, which was not previously held for a vote due to lack of agreement at the time. Now that the voters will decide, once adult use is voted in, the new bill will be able to move forward. Again, this is what's next, but our entire focus right now must remain on the ballot question. Now, that said, we need everyone to do their part, and that includes the New Jersey media. How can the media share or illuminate what is happening in New Jersey? What does the media need to understand, and how can they help support the people? First and foremost, we want a path towards legalization, and it's important for the media to constantly share awareness of the ballot question. While journalists cannot advocate for or against the ballot question, they can certainly bring awareness to it. A concern with vote by mail this year is people will absolutely vote for their choice for president. But because there has not, of course, been the same priority focus around legalization, they may miss this very important ballot question as they mail it back in their ballot. We need to make sure they actually vote on the question. Editorial boards can and will take a position on cannabis, and most favor, but there are a few who do oppose. Social media, we believe, will have a much greater impact on sharing information and promoting the ballot question than traditional media. Now, as we talk about media, there has been so much going on nationally to report on. I want to end by talking about social equity and the impact that Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and COVID all have had on social equity. Let's begin with COVID. When the COVID pandemic hit hard, many states declared cannabis businesses to be essential businesses. If nothing else, this positively influenced the idea of patient equity, whereby access to medicine, whether in a medical or medicinal adult use program, was prioritized in a state of emergency policy where it had never been prioritized before. Certainly, this was less impactful in states that also declared alcohol as essential. Nonetheless, we have opened the door on conversations as it pertains to equitable access to cannabis as medicine, which also disproportionately negatively impacts BIPOC communities, as well as, looking at cost, fear, and shame associated with cannabis use. Now, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the impact of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. For the longest time, cannabis regulators with social equity goals have been trying to salvage poorly designed policies and frameworks purposely intended to keep previous marijuana offenders, a large majority Black, Indigenous, or Hispanic, from participating in a legal cannabis market. However, in the wake of George Floyd's murder and subsequent protests in all 50 states, there has been a huge momentum shift in the policy conversations across the country in regards to cannabis equity. Legislative leaders have a strong motivation to find ways to support, build, and reinvest in Black lives. Meanwhile, the history of racially biased execution of prohibition laws has contributed to sustaining systemic racism in America. This has created a perfect opportunity to address some of the damage to Black lives by dismantling a major tool in the prison pipeline, creating community reinvestment opportunities, and enhancing access to the developing cannabis economy. After nearly 5 years of debating the need for a social equity program in Colorado, the state passed HB 20-1424, establishing social equity licenses in the adult use cannabis program within 20 days of being introduced as new legislation in June 2020. Similarly, in the same month, Portland City Council divested $2.3 million of cannabis tax revenue that was originally allocated to go to the police bureau. A portion of that was added to the city's social equity and educational development, or SEED, initiatives to provide $1 million in ongoing annual funding to communities most impacted by cannabis prohibition. These examples not only set precedent for other states, they also demonstrate how quickly the government can move if properly educated and motivated. This is exciting to see, and it will be interesting to see how other legal states make progress in this area as well. I hope this information was of value today, and I thank you for your time in allowing me to share the 2020 State of the State for New Jersey. Again, my name is Faye Coleman. Thank you and have a great evening.